Ladies and gentlemen, there comes a moment in every man's life when he stands at a crossroads, when the weight of the world presses down on him so heavily that he begins to crack under the pressure. Maybe it's failure, maybe it's heartbreak. Maybe it's the realization that the life he's living isn't the one he envisioned for himself. Whatever the cause, the outcome is the same. He becomes lost, disoriented, a stranger in his own skin. And when a man is broken, you don't always see it right away. Because a broken man doesn't necessarily look weak. He may still go to work, still smile, still play his role. But beneath that mask, there is a silent struggle that eats away at him piece by piece. So how do you recognize it? How do you know if a man is truly broken? And if you see these signs in yourself or in someone you care about, what can be done to rebuild, to restore, to rise again? This is not just about recognizing the symptoms of a broken spirit. It's about understanding how a man can fall apart, and more importantly, how he can put himself back together. Because no man is meant to stay broken. Strength is forged in adversity. And the moment you recognize your wounds is the moment you begin to heal. A man who is truly broken does not always appear that way. He doesn't necessarily crumble in front of others, nor does he openly admit to his struggles. Instead, he hides behind a carefully constructed mask, a facade of competence and strength. He wears it like armor, hoping that if he convinces the world he is fine, maybe, just maybe, he can convince himself too. But deep down, he knows the truth. He knows that something inside of him has fractured, that the weight he is carrying is becoming unbearable. And yet the last thing he will ever do is let anyone see that weakness. Because to admit that he is struggling is, in his mind, to admit defeat. And for a man who has built his identity on the idea that he must always be strong, that is an unbearable prospect. This is the paradox of the broken man. He appears composed, but inside he is in turmoil. He may still show up to work, engage in conversation, even laugh at the right moments. But if you look closely, you'll notice the cracks. There's a distance in his eyes, a slight hesitation in his voice. He's present, but he's not really there. Because a part of him has already withdrawn from the world, retreating into a space where he doesn't have to pretend anymore. He goes through the motions, hoping no one will notice that he is running on empty. But he notices. Every day he feels the weight of that emptiness pressing down on him. And every day he tells himself he just needs to push through. He believes that asking for help is weakness, that vulnerability is something to be ashamed of. And so he isolates himself, thinking that if he can just bear it alone, if he can just keep up the act long enough, maybe the pain will go away. But it doesn't. The more he suppresses, the more he distances himself from who he really is. The more he denies his pain, the more it festers, growing into something even darker. It starts as exhaustion and inability to muster the energy to care about the things he once loved. Then it turns into apathy. Nothing excites him. Nothing moves him. Eventually it becomes resentment toward the world, toward others, toward himself. He begins to wonder if it's even worth it, if there's any point in trying anymore. And that's the real danger. Because once a man loses belief in himself, once he stops seeing a future worth fighting for, he becomes truly lost. But here's the thing, this is not how it has to end. A man is not defined by his lowest moments. He is defined by how he chooses to respond to them. A broken man is not beyond repair, but the first step toward rebuilding is recognizing the truth. And the truth is this: no one makes it through life without struggle. No one is immune to pain, to failure, to moments of despair. But the ones who rise again, the ones who find their way back, are the ones who have the courage to face that reality head on. The mask must come off. The pretense must be abandoned. Because real strength is not pretending to be unbreakable, it is having the humility to acknowledge your wounds and the determination to heal from them. The road to rebuilding is not easy. It requires a man to strip away everything he has used to hide his pain and confront it fully. It demands honesty, self-reflection, and above all, action. He must be willing to ask himself the hard questions. What am I running from? What am I afraid to face? And most importantly, who am I really when all the masks are gone? Because once he dares to answer those questions, once he chooses to stop hiding, he unlocks something powerful. The ability to rebuild himself into someone stronger than he ever was before. No man has to stay broken. No man has to be a prisoner to his past, his failures, or his fears. But the choice to change, to rise, to reclaim his strength, that is his alone to make. And when he finally does, when he finally steps forward with honesty and courage, that is the moment he stops being a broken man and starts becoming something far greater. A broken man does not always realize he is broken. He moves through life carrying burdens that weigh him down, but he tells himself that this is normal, that this is just how things are. He convinces himself that he is simply tired, or that he just needs to push a little harder, work a little longer, endure a little more. But deep down, beneath all the justifications and self-deceptions, something within him is unraveling. He feels it in the way he wakes up without purpose, in the way the things that once brought him joy now seem dull and meaningless. He feels it in the way he isolates himself, avoiding deep conversations, avoiding people who might see through the mask he wears so carefully. He does not share his pain because he has been told that men do not do that. He has been conditioned to believe that admitting struggle is the same as admitting weakness, and that weakness is unacceptable. So he keeps it inside, convincing himself that if he ignores it long enough, it will eventually disappear. But it never does. It grows. It festers. It turns into resentment toward others, resentment toward himself, resentment toward the very world he once wanted to conquer. And when a man begins to resent life itself, he becomes a danger not just to himself, but to those around him. He becomes cold, distant, unable to connect with those who care about him. He stops believing in the possibility of change. He stops believing in himself. A broken man often convinces himself that he is alone in his suffering. He believes that no one else understands, that no one else has felt this way. But that is a lie. Throughout history, countless men have walked this same path, have felt the same weight pressing down on them, have struggled to find a reason to keep going. And yet the strongest among them, the ones who rose above, were the ones who refused to let their suffering define them. They were the ones who looked their pain in the eye and said, "This is not where my story ends." Because here's the truth. A man is not broken because he has suffered. He is broken when he allows his suffering to consume him. Pain is inevitable. Struggle is part of life. But how a man chooses to respond to that struggle determines everything. A man who is broken believes that his past failures define his future. A man who is healing understands that every failure is an opportunity to grow. A broken man sees himself as a victim of circumstance. A strong man understands that his choices shape his destiny. The road back from brokenness is not easy. It requires a man to be brutally honest with himself. It requires him to ask the hard questions he has spent years avoiding. Why do I feel this way? What am I running from? What have I been unwilling to face? And most importantly, what am I going to do about it? Because no one is coming to save him. No one is going to do the work for him. If he wants to reclaim his life, he has to take responsibility for it. And that is not to say that he should do it alone. The lie that a man must face his struggles in isolation is one of the most destructive myths he can believe. Strength is not found in suffering alone. It is found in seeking wisdom, in learning from others, in having the humility to admit when help is needed. A strong man surrounds himself with people who challenge him, who hold him accountable, who push him to become better. A broken man isolates himself, convinced that no one else understands. And in that isolation, he withers. The journey out of brokenness begins with one simple decision: the decision to fight, not just for survival, but for something more, for purpose, for meaning, for the life that he knows, deep down, he was meant to live. He must make the choice to stand back up, even when every part of him wants to stay down. He must make the choice to pursue strength, not the false strength of pretending to be invulnerable, but the real strength that comes from facing his weaknesses head on. Every man will face moments of despair in his life. Every man will feel at some point like he has been pushed to his limit. But the ones who rise above, the ones who turn their suffering into strength, are the ones who refuse to let the darkness consume them. They are the ones who step forward, no matter how heavy the burden, and say, "I will not be defeated." Because in the end, the measure of a man is not whether he falls. It is whether he chooses to rise. A man who is broken does not always realize how deep the fractures run. He may still wake up, go through the motions of his daily life, even achieve success by the world's standards, but something inside him is hollowed out. He carries a weight he cannot name, a fatigue that lingers no matter how much he rests. He tells himself that it is just a phase, that things will improve if he just keeps moving forward, but beneath it all, he knows something has changed. The fire that once burned within him has dimmed, and he no longer recognizes the man staring back at him in the mirror. And what happens when a man no longer recognizes himself? He begins to withdraw. He stops engaging with the world in the way he once did. The things that once excited him now feel like chores. Conversations that once felt meaningful now seem like distractions. He convinces himself that he is simply too busy, that he has too much on his plate, but the truth is he is avoiding something. He is avoiding the realization that he has lost his sense of purpose. And without purpose, a man is adrift. Purpose is not just about having a job or fulfilling obligations. It is about knowing deep in your soul that what you are doing matters, that your existence has meaning beyond mere survival, that your struggles are leading somewhere, shaping you into something greater. A man who loses his purpose does not immediately collapse, he fades. He becomes passive. He allows life to happen to him instead of shaping it with his own hands. He stops taking risks, stops challenging himself, stops pushing forward. He settles for mediocrity, not because he wants to, but because he is too tired to fight against it. And the tragedy of this state is that most men do not even realize they are in it. They function. They get by. They convince themselves that this is simply what adulthood looks like: responsibilities, sacrifices, the slow erosion of ambition. But there is a difference between growing into wisdom and surrendering to stagnation. A wise man understands that hardship is part of the journey. The discipline and sacrifice are necessary for achievement. But a broken man resigns himself to a life without fulfillment because he believes there is no other option. And when a man reaches this point, he is in danger, not just of failure, but of something far worse as resentment. Because a man who feels trapped in his own life, who believes that his dreams are no longer possible, will not simply accept his fate peacefully. He will become bitter. He will look at others who seem to be thriving and feel anger not because he wishes them harm, but because their success reminds him of what he has lost. He will see younger men full of energy and ambition and feel the sting of regret. He will hear stories of men who overcame obstacles and tell himself that they were just lucky, that the world favors some and ignores others. And this bitterness, if left unchecked, will poison him. It will seep into his relationships, his work, his self-perception. It will turn him into someone he never intended to become. But there is a way out, and it begins with a brutal, unforgiving form of honesty. A man must be willing to look at himself, truly look at himself, and ask the hard questions. How did I get here? What choices did I make that led me to this place? What lies have I been telling myself to avoid confronting reality? This is not an easy process. It requires humility. It requires the courage to admit that some of the wounds he carries are self-inflicted. It requires the willingness to take responsibility even when it is painful. And once he has done this, once he has stripped away all the justifications and excuse, she must decide. Will he continue down this path, allowing life to dictate his fate, or will he fight back? Because make no mistake, reclaiming his life will be a fight. It will require effort, discipline, and the willingness to endure discomfort. But what is the alternative? A slow, quiet decline into apathy? A life spent looking back on missed opportunities with regret? That is not a life a man was meant to live. A man is built to struggle, to strive, to create. He is not meant to simply exist, is meant to build, to shape, to push against the boundaries of what is possible. And that fire, that drive, does not simply disappear. It may be buried beneath years of disappointment, but it is still there. And the moment he decides to stop accepting mediocrity, to stop making excuses, to stop allowing fear to dictate his choices, that is the moment he begins to rebuild himself. And the most important thing he must understand is this: he does not have to do it alone. The strongest men in history, the ones who overcame the deepest struggles, did not do it in isolation. They sought out mentors. They surrounded themselves with people who challenged them, who inspired them, who held them accountable. A man who isolates himself in his pain will only sink deeper into it. A man who reaches out for wisdom, who seeks guidance, will find a way forward. So if a man finds himself lost, if he feels that the weight of his past mistakes and disappointments is too great to bear, he must remember this: he has a choice. He can let his struggles define him, or he can use them as fuel to become something greater. But he must decide, because no one is coming to save him. No one is going to do the work for him. If he wants to reclaim his purpose, if he wants to rise from the ashes of his brokenness, he must be the one to take the first step. And once he does, he will realize something powerful was never as lost as he thought he was. He simply needed to remember who he was meant to be. A man does not simply wake up one day and find himself broken. It happens slowly, over time, in a way that is almost imperceptible. It begins with small compromises, things he once held sacred that he starts to neglect. Maybe he stops taking care of his health, dismissing it as unimportant in the face of his obligations. Maybe he starts avoiding challenges, choosing the path of least resistance instead of the one that would make him stronger. Or maybe, worst of all, he stops being honest with himself. He starts rationalizing his failures, blaming the world instead of confronting the uncomfortable truth that he has allowed himself to slip into mediocrity. The first real sign of a broken man is that he no longer believes in his own potential. He tells himself that his dreams were naive, that his ambitions were foolish. He sees other people succeeding, but instead of using that as motivation, he resents them. Not outwardly, perhaps most men in this state do not express their frustration directly. But inwardly, there is a gnawing bitterness, a sense of injustice, a belief that life has somehow conspired against him. And that belief is deadly, because once a man convinces himself that his circumstances are beyond his control, he gives up the only thing that could actually change them: responsibility. Responsibility is the foundation of meaning. Without it, a man drifts. He wakes up with no real direction, no sense of purpose guiding his actions. He may still have duty, she may have a job, a family, obligations that require his attention, but he does not feel that he is actively shaping his life. He is merely reacting to it, and this passivity is corrosive. It erodes his confidence, his drive, his ability to face hardship with resilience. He stops striving, stops improving, stops pushing forward. He begins to settle. And here is the tragedy of it all. He does not even realize it is happening. He convinces himself that he is simply tired, that life is just difficult, that his lack of motivation is temporary. But weeks turn into months, and months turn into years, and the man who once had fire in his soul is now a shadow of what he used to be. He avoids confrontation not because he is incapable of standing up for himself, but because he no longer sees the point. He avoids ambition, not because he lacks the ability, but because he has stopped believing in his own capacity to succeed. The second sign of a broken man is that he isolates himself. Not necessarily in a physical sense. He may still go to work, still interact with his family, still maintain the facade of normalcy, but emotionally, he withdraws. He stops sharing his struggles, stops seeking guidance, stops allowing himself to be vulnerable. He convinces himself that no one would understand, that no one would care, that it is easier to bear the burden alone. But isolation only deepens the wound. It creates an echo chamber of negative thoughts, reinforcing his worst fears and insecurities. A man who is alone in his suffering will begin to turn against himself. He will hear the voice of self-doubt growing louder, telling him that he is not enough, that he has failed, that there is no way forward. And if he listens to that voice for too long, he will start to believe it. He will become his own worst enemy. But the final and most devastating sign of a broken man is when he no longer even tries to fight back. He resigns himself to his fate. He stops dreaming, stops striving, stops believing that change is possible. He accepts his suffering as inevitable, as something he must simply endure, rather than something he can overcome. And that is when true despair sets in, because at that point he has given up not just on himself, but on life itself. But here is what must be understood. No man is beyond redemption. No matter how lost, how broken, how beaten down he may feel, there is always a way back. But it requires something that many are unwilling to do. It requires facing the truth, the hard, uncomfortable, painful truth. It requires looking in the mirror and admitting that the life he is living is not the life he was meant for, that he has allowed fear, complacency, and resentment to dictate his actions. And most of all, it requires the courage to take responsibility, because responsibility is the antidote to despair. The moment a man decides to stop blaming the world and start taking ownership of his actions, everything changes. He may not be able to fix everything immediately. Some wounds take time to heal, some mistakes take time to correct, but the simple act of taking control of his own fate reignites something within him. It reminds him that he is not powerless, that he is not a victim, that he is capable of rebuilding himself no matter how far he has fallen. And that process is not easy. It demands discipline, effort, and an unwavering commitment to self-improvement. It requires cutting out destructive habits, eliminating toxic influences, and surrounding himself with people who challenge him rather than enable his weaknesses. But the alternative, the slow, silent decay of a life without purpose, is far worse. A man must decide. He must decide whether he will continue to let life happen to him or whether he will take the reins and carve out his own path. And that decision is what separates those who remain broken from those who rise from the ashes of their own failures. It is not an easy path, but it is the only one worth taking. Because, in the end, the only real failure is refusing to try. A broken man often carries his pain in silence. He does not announce it to the world, nor does he seek pity. He simply endures. And at first glance, he may not even appear broken. He may go about his daily routine, do what is expected of him, fulfill his responsibilities with a quiet sense of duty. But beneath that exterior, there is a war raging within him, a war between the man he once was, the man he hoped to become, and the man he sees in the mirror. And when a man reaches that point, when he no longer recognizes himself, it is not just his body that is exhausted, it is his soul. One of the clearest signs of this internal collapse is when a man no longer sees the point in striving. There was a time when he had ambitions, when he set goals for himself, when he believed in his own potential. But somewhere along the way, he started to question whether any of it really mattered. He told himself that he was simply being realistic, that he was adjusting to the harsh truths of life, but in reality, he was slowly surrendering. The fire that once burned within him began to dim, and with it, his belief in his own ability to change his circumstances. He stopped fighting not because he had won, but because he had convinced himself that victory was impossible. And here's the tragedy of it all. No man wakes up one day and suddenly decides to abandon his dreams. It happens gradually, in the smallest of ways. He makes compromises with himself. He procrastinates, telling himself that tomorrow will be different. He lowers his expectations, convincing himself that he is being practical. He stops pushing himself, believing that he is simply too tired, too busy, too overwhelmed. And with each small concession, he drifts further away from the man he once was, until one day he looks back and wonders how he ever believed he could have been more. A man who is broken does not always appear broken. He may walk the same streets, engage in the same conversations, and perform the same responsibilities, yet beneath the surface something has fractured. The weight of past disappointments, the accumulation of failures, the slow erosion of self-belief, these things do not manifest immediately, nor do they announce themselves with a dramatic collapse. They creep in like a slow poison, draining him of his vitality, his ambition, his very sense of purpose. He does not wake up one day and declare himself defeated. Rather, he stops resisting the forces that pull him downward. And in that slow descent, he loses himself. You can see it in his eyes first. There is a dullness there, a kind of resignation that was not present before. Once, they held fear a drive, a hunger, a belief in something greater. But now, they reflect only exhaustion, as though he has already seen the outcome of every battle and decided it is not worth the fight. It is not that he lacks intelligence or capability. In fact, he may be just as sharp as he ever was. But intelligence without purpose is a heavy burden. And when a man stops believing in his own ability to change his circumstances, he becomes a prisoner of his own mind. He withdraws not necessarily from society, but from meaningful engagement. He stops pursuing things that once brought him joy or fulfillment. His conversations become shallow, his actions mechanical. He may still participate in life, but he no longer invests in it. And when a man reaches that state, when he becomes indifferent to his own progress, is in real danger. Because the moment he stops caring is the moment he stops growing. But where does this brokenness come from? It does not emerge from a single failure or setback, but from a repeated pattern of pain and disillusionment. A man who once dared to dream, to strive, to reach for something beyond himself, eventually finds that the world does not easily yield to his desires. He is met with rejection, disappointment, betrayal. He is told he is not good enough, not strong enough, not worthy enough. And though he may fight against these voices at first, there comes a time when he begins to wonder if they are right. If maybe, just maybe, he has been deluding himself all along. And when that thought takes root, it is like a parasite. It feeds on his doubts, magnifies his insecurities, reinforces his worst fears. He starts to believe that no matter how hard he tries, the outcome will always be the same. So why bother? Why struggle? Why expose himself to further pain? It is easier, far easier, to retreat into a state of passive existence, to lower his expectations, not just of the world, but of himself. But here's the thing. A man cannot escape suffering. He can only choose the kind of suffering he is willing to endure. The suffering of discipline, of struggle, of striving towards something meaningfuler, the suffering of regret, of stagnation, of a life lived in quiet desperation. And one of these is far worse than the other, because the suffering that comes with the pursuit of something greater at least carries with it the possibility of redemption. The suffering of surrender, on the other hand, is a slow decay, It is a betrayal of everything he could have been. So what does he do? How does he rebuild himself when he has lost the will to even try? It starts with responsibility, with taking ownership of his own existence. Because the moment a man decides that his fate is in his own hands, regardless of past failures, regardless of what the world has told him, he begins to reclaim his power. And that is the first step to breaking free from the chains of his own despair. But responsibility is not enough. He must also act. He must force himself to do what is necessary, even when he does not feel like it. He must set small, tangible goals and commit to them, no matter how insignificant they may seem. He must surround himself with people who hold him to a higher standard, who challenge him rather than enable his weaknesses. He must cut out the distractions, the numbing habits, the self-destructive patterns that have kept him stuck in place. Most importantly, he must confront the truth, the painful, undeniable truth about who he has become and how he allowed himself to get there. Because only when a man is willing to see himself clearly, without excuse or self-pity, can he begin to transform. And transformation is not easy. It requires pain, sacrifice, relentless effort. But it is possible. It is always possible. A broken man is not a lost cause. He is not beyond redemption. But he must decide. He must decide whether he will continue to let life happen to him or whether he will stand up, take control, and forge a new path. And that decision, simple yet profoundest, the defining moment that separates those who rise from those who remain in the shadows of their own despair. A broken man is not beyond repair, but his recovery begins with a choice and unwavering decision to reclaim his life. He must confront his weaknesses, take responsibility, and commit to action, even in the face of doubt. Growth is painful, but so is stagnation, and only one leads to redemption. The path forward is never easy, but it is always possible. He must rise, not because it is simple, but because the alternative is a slow, silent decay.